This is really exciting. A lot of people in the room may be familiar with the concept of basic income, which is getting particularly hot in, I mean, a 100-year-old idea that has very recently become interesting to the tech crowd. I am here with, as soon as I knew I was coming to New Orleans and doing a basic income panel, I was like, gotta reach out to Scott. If you're not familiar with Scott's work, Scott is a basic income activist and thinker, but also is like kind of is like the air traffic controller for basic income media worldwide. Follow this guy on Twitter and you'll see everything published. You moderate the subreddit, etc. Talk about we'll do the first minute of, for those of you who are not familiar exactly what basic income is, familiarize the audience a little bit with the sort of like very seemingly radical idea.
Sure. So one way to really look at this is that right now we all have a minimum income guarantee of $0. And a basic income is essentially just raising that floor to basically a platform above the poverty line of $1,000 a month, at least here in the US or so. And if you do that, if we just give people money for being a citizen, then there's so many things that you no longer have to spend money on that we do right now. You don't have to target assistance through welfare, and you don't have to spend all these costs instead on the cost of homelessness and the cost of poverty through the cost of crime, the connection between income and health, which means that we spend so much more on the costs of healthcare. There are so many costs involved in having a minimum income of $0. So if we just raise that amount, it really is a very transformational idea. And the more you look into it, the more things that you see that it intersects with, and how much of a difference it would make in so many people's lives, and even the economy as a whole.
So you were talking about when you said something really interesting, which is the idea of basically giving money out to just about every American adult, regardless of their employment, regardless of et cetera, as a universal, guaranteed, regular, generally poverty level income, strikes a lot of people. It's interesting what you said about the cost savings there. You talked about the drive you recently took. I thought that was like an amazing analogy.
Yeah, I wrote an article before comparing basic income as being a social vaccine. And if you look at this as a vaccine, you can see, we all know that it's an ounce of prevention versus like a pound of cure. It's just so much cheaper to actually prevent things from happening in advance instead of treating them after the fact. It's just so much more costly. And so if you look at basic income from that perspective, you can see that there really are a lot of expenses that we do right now. Like the costs of crime have been calculated at over $1 trillion per year. And if you can think of the effects that you would have on that, and we actually have seen the effects of this too. As far as crime goes, there was an actual universal basic income experiment in Namibia where crime was reduced over 40% from just giving everybody this basic income.
So let's talk about real quick, more like primer for people who aren't like, wait, who like are into the movement, et cetera. People talk about like paying, like how could we ever pay for if we just gave everybody money? Obviously, there's the elimination of existing welfare programs, but also for many people who in the audience who aren't familiar, or a lot of people who even are trying to advance the idea of a basic income, we already have a basic income in a part of the U.S.
Yeah, it's very fascinating to actually look at the Alaska dividend as a basic income that has existed since 1982 in Alaska. And of course, it's not high enough to be considered basic, because the basic part means it has to be able to cover your basic needs and eliminate poverty, essentially. But there in Alaska, the most recent payout was about $2,100 per person. And that's man, woman, and child even too. So if you look at a household of, say, 5 people, then you're already over $10,000 in Alaska that they got for being a resident of Alaska. And because of that, they actually do have a higher minimum income level. As I said, here, we have a minimum income of $0 for everybody, except for people in Alaska. They have a minimum income of around $2,000 per year. That's their absolute minimum. They earn everything on top of that. And if you look at that, we can actually look at Alaska and some of those effects that we've seen there as well as being something we can look forward to. Like one of the effects from Alaska, if you look at there, they're among the lowest inequality in all states in the country. They're among the lowest in poverty in the country. And there's even like smaller that are actually quite transformative effects, as in babies there are born with better birth weights, and that's attributed to better maternal nutrition. So again, this looks at, back to the savings idea of what happens when you have like a population who are continually being born healthier and spend the rest of their lives healthier.
And now, I do want to perk some ears in the audience because even if not everybody in here is familiar with basic income, I'm sure a couple of people here may have heard of Y Combinator. Tell me a little bit about some of the earliest experiments, because right now, basic income is an idea that spans 100 plus years of American history. Martin Luther King, Bertrand Russell were all advocates of guaranteed minimum income. Recently, though, basic income, because of automation, is hot again amongst the tech set. Talk a little bit about, because you've been more directly involved with a little bit of this than somebody who's just covered it as a journalist, about some of the current experimentations with basic income, the pilot programs, and exactly what the hell we're trying to learn.
Well, yeah, so Sam Altman is a big fan of the idea of basic income. He sees it from the potential innovation angle. And there are others as well. Albert Wenger is another one who understands this as being kind of a venture capital for the people. And if you look at it that way, then there's so much that people are prevented from doing because they don't have the resources to do it. If you look at just seed funding and capital in general, in order to do these startups and stuff, you need to have this income. You have to get a loan. You have to get out there. You have to get that money somehow, and you need money in order to operate through the points where there's no profit. You have to reach that point where it's profitable. Well, if everybody has a basic income, it's that much easier to actually do these startups. You don't have to be like, people can actually work for free in these things because they're passionate about wanting to start up these businesses. And whereas before, you couldn't do that. You actually have to have that funding in order to do that. So that's one of the reasons why Sam Altman is a big fan of this. And if we want to look at some of the earlier experiments, it's fascinating to look at those too. Like if you look at the Mead-Beam experiment, which I mentioned earlier, that was a full universal basic income experiment. And another experiment that they did was in India. That was a slightly larger experiment. And there have been cash transfer experiments as well. If you look at unconditional cash transfers, which is a form of cash transfer where there are, of course, no conditions, if those are high enough to be considered a basic income in those areas, then you can see the effects there too as far as basic income goes. So we've got like unconditional cash transfers that have been going on elsewhere, like in Liberia and Lebanon,
as opposed to the idea of charity, because a lot of the interesting cash transfers. Sorry for interrupting. A lot of the interesting cash transfers is this. There's this radical idea that we as a nation provide quite a bit of aid overseas, and for a long time there has been an enormous group of people who have examined that aid and are now saying, what if we took that same level of dedication and those resources and gave cash instead, directly to people, and let it control on their own, which is directly analogous to the idea that in America, what if instead of food stamps, lifeline, public housing, we replaced it with money and money and money for everyone, and let them control it on their own.
Yeah, and Give Directly is this charity that I feel is just disrupting this entire idea of charity. And it's that if you want to give something to someone, is that better than just giving them cash? And they've been testing this like very rigorously with randomly controlled experiments. And they've been doing it in Kenya and Uganda. And they actually just made huge news recently because they're going to do essentially the world's biggest universal basic income experiment soon. And what they're going to do is they're going to give a basic income to entire villages in Kenya for the next 10 to 15 years. And they want to do this to see like what are the really like long-term effects. And if you look at just some of the even more short-term effects of what they've already been seeing from giving those cash transfers in Kenya and Uganda already, it's incredible to see just the jumps in entrepreneurship, especially. Like if you look at like in Namibia, the jump in entrepreneurship was 301%. People like take this income, like this great story from the Namibia one actually was a woman used the very first payment to actually buy flour and yeast, and then she just kind of put together a makeshift oven, and she became like a baker. And so if you think about that, like that's on one hand, yeah, she used that to become her own, to start her own business. But the reason it worked out so well is because everyone in the village was given money too, and they became her customers. So you can see that there's like you got to have that you got to have the supply and the demand. You need both of those, and when you do that, like it's really transformative.
And one of the interesting things is this idea of giving direct money. A lot of times it evokes this notion that what if we gave everybody a basic income, everybody would become lazy and not work, which is tantamount to the idea there is a political, often traditionally in the past 30 years, it has been a conservative idea that welfare leads to laziness. And when I wrote recently, we talked about this back in the day, the idea that once you go and interrogate, one of the nice things about all these early pilot programs is if you go and interrogate the idea welfare makes people lazy, you will find a total poverty of research that says either way whether or not that's true. We're like so lacking for research. So now it's interesting to see that the tech scene is like leading programs that will give us some of like the first ideas of what's possible.
Yeah. Actually, like it's interesting how food stamps actually have been connected to entrepreneurship as well, as in just the idea of knowing that you won't starve because you possibly can't apply for food stamps. Like it's not about having it, it's just knowing that it's there. It means that it increases entrepreneurship. And so again, there's so much risk and security involved in this. Whereas if you actually raise everyone's level of security, then they will be able to take more risks. And if they can take more risks, then just imagine the innovation that's possible through that.
Yeah, so one of the things that people ask generally is, okay, so like a certain core of people are excited about basic income. We have a good idea that it might increase entrepreneurship, but how do you make a political case? Like it's all well and good to like come here and like talk about basic income and why it's exciting, but also like we need to like vote for it. We need to get it. It would be a very radical welfare reform that would require a lot of political will. How do you foresee a realistic path playing out that we actually get something like a basic income, as opposed to the many times it has come up in American history and just sort of led to a flash in the pan?
Well, if it's one thing I've noticed, it's that this idea is not left or right, and that given time, people actually come around to liking it once they really start thinking about it, even if they either like it immediately or it takes some time and then they like it later. And so really our biggest barrier to building up a really strong movement in order to get this in the United States and everywhere else is actually just to make sure everybody knows that the idea exists in the first place. So if you're a part of the media, if you're a journalist, if you're a writer, if you have a voice of any kind, you need to be getting out there and just like talking about it, just sharing stuff and getting people to understand that it is an idea that's an actual option that does exist, and that we actually increasingly will need it as time goes on. I wrote an article about self-driving trucks and the effects of that, and I've also written about the effects of a deep learning, artificial intelligence on the labor market. And we really are looking at some serious labor market disruption in the coming years.
Labor market disruption is a very exciting thing to say here. It's code for everybody's going to fucking lose their job.
Right. And we really have to make sure that we don't have this system that we have right now where you lose your job and you have to like hope of getting it on welfare, and maybe you get it, maybe you don't, and then you need to get like a part-time job or would like to, but then you're thinking, well, if I do that, then I'll lose my welfare, and it gets get more expensive to even have that in the first place. Like, we need a system that's built around resilience, where you don't have to actually go through all of this work and all of this effort, and people fail and people fall through the cracks and people get caught in these nets that we call safety nets. Just get rid of all of that. Essentially, it's a way of essentially paving over poverty instead of having like dirt roads that we used to have that traps you and prevented people from traveling and hurt the cost of business and everything. Just pave over it. Let people exist on top of the poverty level. And if you do that, then it just changes the game entirely as far as our future, where technology can actually work for us instead of against us.
All right. Scott, thank you so much for being here. Thank you guys for sticking around. It was really incredible. Obviously, now it is lunch. And round of applause for Scott. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.